Sessions were not the same in the first one. I don't know, depending on questions and stuff, kind of get into slightly different things, go on different tangents. So try to keep it interesting in my head. I remember there was one semester, I'm also a professor at Cal State Fullerton University, where I had to teach the same class back to back. Like I taught it 1 hour and then I had to walk to a different classroom and teach that exact same class again. And like, I got sick of hearing myself say the same jokes and the same stupid things that I say. So this is a challenge to do the same thing 4 times in a row. But I am super happy to be here. That being said, Allison was in the first group and I asked her and she said there are 42, I believe, or 41 PGA sections. And I think this is my 26th one that I'm doing. So I've done more than half of them, but it took me this long to get to my own section. I don't know why it took so long, but so I live kind of near LAX airport. I'm a professor at Cal State Fullerton University. I've been there since 2008. But I've actually been doing golf-related biomechanics research since about 1998. I believe during my undergrad I did a thesis project with my professor looking at some different things in golf. And so ever since then, I have been studying the biomechanics of a golf swing. And I think my overarching conclusion of those 28 years of doing golf-related biomechanics testing and research is that everybody does it differently. Doesn't matter what level of golfer you look at, everybody does it differently. One of the first studies I did at Cal State Fullerton was looking at the ground reaction forces of good players versus not so good players. So I had access to all of the Cal State Fullerton team and all of the Long Beach State team, which is about 10 men and 10 women from each team. All Division I golfers plus handicaps, shooting under par all the time. And then I went into my kinesiology class, who are all young athletic kids that play sports and work out. And I said, if you've ever hit a golf ball but never had a formal lesson, you can be in my study as a beginner golfer. So like if you go out to the range with your buddies or you play with your dad the odd time, whatever. And I got 40 of those. And I compared the ground forces and even each group, the spread of what each player was doing, even amongst the good players, was massive. Like the graphs were all over the place. And I was having a really hard time making sense of the data. So I colored all the graphs from one group in red and all the graphs from the other group in blue. And I walked across the hall to my kinesiology colleague's office, who knows how to read the graphs. And I put them down in front of him and I said, tell me which one's which. Which one do you think is the good players and which one do you think are the bad players? And he guessed wrong. And so that made me think, geez, I don't think we really understand much about how these ground reaction force work in good players. And I'm going to talk to you about a lot of mistakes I've made along the way using ground reaction forces and teaching players, but I think learned a lot from every single one of the mistakes I made as we went along. And I think we're in a pretty good spot now in terms of understanding how to use this information to help our players. And so the main purpose of this talk is, I think, one of the primary or the main uses of ground reaction forces is trying to match up the engine that we produce from the ground to the position of the golf club in space. Because we have to match those things up. And if we get it wrong, I think a couple of things can happen. One, we can have our players play terrible. And two, we may injure our players as well. And so it was interesting to me listening to Yanni Sang this morning, talking about her journey and the injuries she's had and the bad golf she's played. I think that had we got her on force plates, the minute she decided to try to hit a draw, we would have aborted mission very quickly on that. I always tell people force plates are kind of like a neurological exam. These plates right here take 1,000 pictures every second as you move that golf club through space. Do you know if you take a video with your iPhone how fast it films? 60. Used to be 30, now the faster new cameras are 60. So think about it, you're taking 60 pictures every second with your iPhone, this takes 1,000. And so I have seen it multiple times. If I give you something that your brain is not comfortable with, or if I try to make you do something that doesn't match your anatomy, I think your brain knows it and it freaks out a little bit. Even though you may not be able to see it on camera, you start seeing these really shaky forces. And with a lot of the people that I know that use these things now, I'm telling people one of the main jobs that you have as a golf coach is to smooth out these forces. If somebody comes to see you and the forces are really jaggedy and you give them a drill and they get smoother, you probably did something really good for that player. You've given them something that their brain is a little bit more comfortable with. And I would bet my mortgage that if we could get in a time machine and go back to the first day Yanni Singh tried to hit a draw, those forces would have been super shaky. And we could have convinced her not to go down that path quite as long. Jordan, who is the head of the education here, lives very close to me, and I've worked with him on his swing for a really long time. And we went down the wrong path with his swing for about 2 years, until I just threw up my hand and said, screw it, let's just do it this way. And the graphs got a lot smoother and his game got a lot better. Again, if I had known 2 years ago what I knew now, we wouldn't have gone down that path for 2 years. It would have been about 10 minutes or 5 minutes. I also think this helps me a lot working with junior golfers to figure out where their gift lies, to make sure we don't take their gift away from them. I've had 2 very interesting conversations in the last, 5 years or so. One with Justin Thomas's dad, asking him how he knew to let Justin keep jumping at it. Because I was a pretty good junior player in the mid-90s, and I would go to junior clinics and golf teachers would be on their hands and knees holding kids' feet on the ground, saying, no, 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 this is not basketball. We do not jump in this sport. If Justin Thomas's dad had done that to him, none of us would know who Justin Thomas is. He'd be selling insurance right now, probably, or something along those lines. The other conversation that I had was with George Genkis about Matt Wolff. Because remember the old golf swing manuals said that the butt of the club has to point at the target line here? How did you not to screw with that? And he's like, I don't know, man, he was Gucci and he was smashing it, and he left it alone. So I think there's a lot of brilliance in what you don't touch in somebody's swing and what you leave alone. And I think you can make much more educated decisions using force plates to understand what the gift of that particular athlete is. But everybody does it differently. Everybody uses the ground differently, and so you have to create matchups between where they position their body and the club in space and what their engine is from the ground. Also, the biggest I would say sales pitch for force plates is that you just really can't see this with your eye. I would say that I have probably watched more golf swings and then clicked my computer to look at the forces that just happened than anybody else on the planet. I'm going to give myself that badge of honor. I don't think too many people have done it more than me. And I guess wrong often, especially with good athletes. With Mrs. Haberkamp, sometimes you can kind of guess. But when it's a good athlete, they fool me often. So the 2 stories I always tell about that is when we first started doing force plate stuff, I was working a lot with Mike Adams, and we used to categorize golfers into gliders, ones that use predominantly lateral forces, spinners, people that use majority rotational forces, and then launchers, people that kind of use majority vertical forces. And anytime I'm around a high-end golf teacher and they leave me alone with their computer, I generally dig a little bit to see if I could learn something. So the first job that Swing Catalyst gave me was to fly to Dallas and work with Cameron McCormick. So he had just purchased a system, and they wanted me to teach them how to use it. So I went there, we worked together for a bit. He left the room and I searched through his computer and found Mr. Spieth on there. And I loaded it up. What do you think? Everybody's seen Spieth swing, right? What do you think? Is he glider, spinner, or jumper? You would say glider, right? His majority force is a vertical force. And without knowing that information, you could royally screw up Jordan Spieth's golf swing. Now, Jordan Spieth is probably one of the most incredible athletes to ever hold one of these things. And the vertical force that he creates with his ankle in this position, if I did it, I would snap my ankle. But you know what? I'm not Jordan Spieth. He is an incredible athlete. And I always tell people, what makes incredible athletes incredible athletes? They can do things in positions that other people can't. And so knowing that can be very helpful before trying to teach something to him that may teach him out of something he already does very well. The other time I was really surprised, and this experience led me down the path that we're going to go down today, was I was at Claude Harmon's facility in Florida, the Floridian. And I searched through his computer and found Dustin Johnson in there. What would you guess Dustin Johnson? Like belt buckle left of the target at impact? You would guess spinner. He's lateral. And I started looking at his swing. And when you look at Dustin Johnson's swing down the line, he has some of the highest hands in golf. His hands are up here. If he was a spinner, he'd be in trouble. He'd be a 27 left path cutter and we would never know his name. He needs some of that lateral from up here to make his golf swing work. And so that's one thing that I now evaluate, and one thing that you have to think about is where the net plane of the golf swing is. And I kind of work on a continuum from Dustin Johnson, Justin Thomas. I have Jim Furyk in my lecture here. Very high hands type of player. Who's on the other end of that spectrum?
I noticed that some of them, like Fowler, but they're coming up.
Yeah, Kuchar. Kuchar is here.
Yeah.
And so if you taught Dustin Johnson to use the ground the way Kuchar does, he wouldn't be anywhere near the tour. And if you taught Matt Kuchar to use the ground the way Dustin Johnson does, he wouldn't be anywhere near the tour either. He'd be 4 right or snapper left. And so it is really important that we match up the engine from the ground and the position, the net position of that club in space. It's also really important we know where your body is positioned in space, because that really creates the engine. And so with Swing Catalyst, we've been measuring the engine from the ground for a long time. We've been measuring the forces that you produce between the feet and the ground, but we haven't until very recently been able to measure the position of the body in space. This animation is from my lab at Cal State Fullerton, where we have cameras circling the lab, kind of like a gear system. It's qual assist, but we put dots on you and the club so we can see where the club is in space and we see where those forces are. So prior to very recently, if you wanted this information, if you wanted to know where all your segments in your club was in space and where the ground reactions forces were relative to that, you had kind of 4 options. You had my lab at Fullerton, you had Sasha McKenzie's lab in Canada, you had Dr. Kwan's lab in Texas, and then you probably could have gone to the Penn State lab too, where they do a bunch of this research. So you kind of had 4 options, which is very difficult for people to get access to this. And so now with our system and a face on and down the line camera, you can get pretty close to it. We have markerless motion capture and face on and down the line that can be combined together to get 3D, and we know where the 3D forces are between the feet and the ground, so we can start to get really good access to this information. And I think this is the most important thing we got to start thinking about when we're teaching golf. So I'm going to give you an introductory kinesiology lesson here. So I still teach kinesiology. I teach anatomy at Cal State Fullerton. And one of the first lectures is about fundamental planes of movement. And so if you're looking at me in a face-on way like you guys are right now, you're looking at me in the frontal plane, which is a plane like this that cuts me kind of in a front and back half. And you can see that I've moved my arm through 90 degrees in this plane, right? Because you can see that. But if I do this, can you tell how many degrees I went through from where you are? No, you can't see that because I'm moving out of the plane in which you are viewing me. If you wanted to see me do this, how would you have to look at me? From above, right? You'd have to have a camera coming down to see that this arm has gone through 90 degrees, to see exactly how many degrees that arm has gone through. This kind of plane that you'd need to see from above, we call the transverse plane. So frontal plane, looking from straight on, transverse plane, looking from down. This kind of tabletop looking plane, transverse plane, and this one here is the frontal plane. If I took a pure frontal plane golf swing, it would look like this. I would lift this club up and I'd drop it on the ball and swing it like this. Have you ever seen a golf swing that looks like this? Me neither. Never seen one that looks exactly purely in the frontal plane. If I swung it like this, That would be a pure transverse playing golf swing. I once saw one of those trick shot artists guy tee a ball up way up here, and he kind of did this. So I have seen a golf swing that looks like this. You don't see it too often. Where would you see somebody doing this? A pure transverse plane type swing? Baseball, exactly. As the ball gets up in the zone, it becomes a very transverse plane task. And as the ball gets down in the zone, it becomes more of a frontal plane task. I started working for Swing Catalyst in 2015, and then in 2018, the Dodgers and the Cubs called Swing Catalyst and said, we saw some of your golf stuff, we think it's cool, we think it could work for baseball, can you build us a baseball system? So in 2018, we built them a baseball system. We now have 24 major league teams using our system for hitting. Last year around this time, I got a call from the Toronto Blue Jays, and they hired me as a consultant. Their hitting coach, a guy named David Popkins, he's the head hitting coach for the Toronto Blue Jays, has one of the smallest egos I've ever been around of an elite coach in any sport. He is so open to learning and learning new things and trying to do things differently. And we had a little bit of success last year. We're that short of winning it all. But we learned a ton. I've learned a ton about the mechanics of swinging a stick from baseball. So I kind of took in 2018 what I had from golf to baseball, and in the last, whatever it's been, 8 years, I've learned a ton from baseball and brought it back to golf. And so one thing that I think is super important is trying to understand the engine of the player in the transverse and frontal planes and how efficient those engines are. So I would say a very transverse plane golf swing, or the most transverse plane net swing plane that I've seen, is Matt Kuchar. Right? It's probably the flattest, deepest hands in golf. I have worked with Matt Kuchar in the past several times, and he's always come to me looking for more speed. And I've added speed every single time I've worked with him, but he's stuck with it for about 3 shots until one ball curved left, and then he's like, I'm out. A lot of the times what I have added with him was more vertical force into his swing. And what we're going to learn later is a transverse plane swing, vertical is the worst thing to add because it actually doesn't occur in that plane. And so if I ever get a chance to work with him again, we're staying entirely in the transverse plane. I've never worked with Jim Furyk before, but I've done a lot of work recently with Greg Rose. And he's worked with Jim Furyk before and tells me his engine is entirely in the frontal plane because those hands are so high. He needs that frontal plane engine to make that swing work. So to me, is there a drone coming to get me? To me, the magic of golf is matching up the engine from the ground to the net swing plane. So if somebody gets on a plate and hits and there's a mismatch, do I adjust the hands to get more in the plane of the swing or adjust the ground and leave the hands alone? I do not know the answer to that question. I think that becomes more of an art than a science. Greg Rose, who I've worked with a ton recently, I don't think he's ever worked with a 20 handicap, or it's very rare, right? He's working with the best players in the world. And what he's told me is he hates to change a really good player's hand position. Like to tell Matt Kuchar to go, no, I want you up here, he's going to tell you where to go, I think. And so he always goes to refining the ground and leaving the hands alone. I think if you're working with really good players, that's probably a good place to go. But how many people work with only the best players in the world? Neither do I. We work with a whole bunch of different players. And I've had it very recently several times, even with college players, like players that are playing Division I college, where they're very efficient in the frontal plane, but their hands are back here. And all I say is on this next one, get your hands closer to the ceiling than get the club closer to the ceiling than you do to the back wall there. And I've seen with just that in one swing, club head speed go up like 6-7 miles an hour by just getting the club in the same plane where they're very efficient at using the ground. So, but I think that becomes more of an art than a science. You have to ask the player questions. You have to watch what they do and where they're more comfortable. We're going to hit shots at the end of this session, but in the very first session today, the lady got up to hit shots, and I put the ball right here because it's in the zone for the quad, and she kept pushing it away from her, pushing it away, pushing it away. She didn't feel comfortable with it in here. What does that cue in my head? She's not frontal, she's more transverse. So I'm thinking all these things in my head as I see them do things and move around, and so these are the things that you have to talk about. I also, with good players, always ask, like, when you played your best, what was the flight? Because generally transverse plane are going to be cutters or leftward swing direction people, and frontal plane people generally can draw it a little better. That's not true all the time, but these are the kind of questions you start to ask to try to figure out what is most, or what is optimal for that person. But I think, to me, one of the best ways to figure this out, even though you can ask some questions and you can do a whole bunch of things, is what my friend John Dunnigan told me. Does anybody know John Dunnigan? He's in the Philly section. He's done a lot of work into motor learning science, which is understanding how to teach somebody a motor task. Because how we teach somebody a motor task is way different from how we teach somebody a cognitive task. Like if you're learning how to read or learning how to do math, what do? Like when we did our times tables as kids, right? You just repeat it over and over again. And that's how you learn cognitive things, is to do the same thing, repeat it over and over again. That is not how you learn motor tasks. All of us in this here have at some point in our lives learned how to walk. None of us remember it, but we all did it at some point. I've watched my son do that. I have a 3-year-old son. I watched him learn how to walk about 2 years ago. And I don't know if you guys were paying attention, but or if you're around, but in the early 2000s, Greg Rose used to do a lot of work with a guy named Gray Cook, who invented the functional movement screen. And the two of them worked together to develop the TPI screen and all that cool stuff. I went to see them at a fitness conference, and I'm gonna say around 2004-ish. And I remember Greg talking about how bad those things are for kids, like jolly jumpers, where you like hang the kid by their pelvis basically, and there's toys here. Basically those are so they don't get in trouble, right? Once they start crawling, they can start getting in trouble, but if you hang them with some toys, they don't get in trouble and you're fine. But what they suggested was that's taking a kid who's not ready to be vertical yet and propping them up vertical, and that skips a lot of stages of how a human should learn how to move. And that stuck with me for a long time. So when we had our son, I told my wife, we're not getting one of those things. And she's like, what should we get instead? And the answer is a playpen, but I said a cage. And so it took a lot of convincing to get her to the point that we bought a playpen. But we did. Big playpen, took up the whole living room. She wasn't too happy about it, but it is basically a cage, right? It's a big fenced-in area with padding in the middle. We put a bunch of toys in there, and whenever we had to do stuff so he didn't get in trouble, we just put him in there. And he crawled around, and he'd play with his toys, and then eventually he learned how to climb up the wall and stand. And he would stand holding onto the rail of the playpen. And then he got adventurous, and he'd let go. And what do you think happened? Whew, boom, fell on his butt. Did it again, boom, fell on his butt. And I imagine that went probably for about a week. In his brain, he's like, that sucks. I don't like falling on my butt. So I got to get my center of mass a little bit forward. So then he took his hand off that and tried to move forward, and we had a couple real miraculous face plants. And I'm sure in his brain he said, well, that's no good either. I got to find the middle. And he found the middle, and now he's walking and running and golfing and playing soccer and doing all the stuff that 3-year-olds do. That is one of the best ways to learn a motor task, is to fail in both directions. How many people ever taken like a 6-iron or 5-iron and got out to the range with a bucket of balls and hit the same shot, whatever number, 100 times? We've all done it, right? Awful. We didn't learn anything in that however long we were doing it. I always tell my players that this right here is not golf. And this here is not to be hitting a perfect shot every time. How many people have gone to the range and hit every ball perfect on the range and then gone to the golf course and sucked? Everybody's done it, right? Well, that's because you did not learn anything on the range. Because one of the best ways to learn is to fail. So probably 2 years ago now, I got a call from Rick Sessinghouse. And he said, can you come and work with Colin? And I said, 100% I can. Like, why? Why do you want me to work with Colin? And he's like, well, he and Xander play practice rounds together. And they, on a stock hole, they always hit it about the same length. And then they get on a wide open par 5, and Xander pumps it 30 past Colin. And Colin's like, he's got another gear. He's like, I don't know where my gear is. I don't have another gear. Like, and so Rick's like, do you think we can find his other gear? And I'm like, well, I don't know, I'll try. So they brought me into the Urban Golf Performance in LA there to work with them. And at the time, what I noticed is every good player or every player that hit it really long that I've been around has some kind of trigger to, like, you know, rev the engine before they take it away. And what I noticed in Colin was he was like, his graphs looked like he was dead until the club moved away from the ball. It was like flat line, flat line, flat line, flat line. And then he moved the club away and they started to do stuff where people who hit it far never saw that. So I was like, Colin, I think we need to rev the engine somehow to get more speed. He's like, cool, what do you got for me? And this was 2 or 3 years ago when I was working closely with Bernie Najar quite a bit, who works with Kyle Berkshire, one of the longest hitters in the world. And he does this like rocking thing before he takes the club away. I'm like, Colin, give this a try. So I want you to like rock back and forth. As soon as your right leg hits the ground, take the club away and hit it. And I turned Colin Morikawa into like a 20 handicap. He was whoosh, like snap hooking these balls, hitting it awful. And so I started to look at the force plate as he's doing this. And what I was found in his normal swing, I think he was getting like 75, maybe 70% into his right side. And when he started rocking, he was getting like 85 or 90. So he was kind of getting off of it more, moving laterally, dropping the path to the inside and hitting these snap hooks. And he hit one and it goes, whoosh, and he goes, I fucking hate that shot. And so I walked up to him and I was like, and then I showed him the graph and I was like, so when we're doing this rocking, you're getting more into your trail side, which is causing this shot that you hate. On this next one, give me the complete opposite. I want you to feel like you're like completely stacked over top of it on the backswing. And his little peeler fade came back. He's like, oh, interesting. And I was like, so on the golf course, if it starts moving a little left, it's probably just getting a little too much into your trail side. And we need to kind of drop that off a little bit. And he was happy. He learned something and then he left to go work out in the gym. But we didn't find his extra gear. And then, so what I've started to do is now study long hitters and found that there's basically 2 types of triggers in long hitters. There's the Kyle Berkshire, which is a frontal plane rock side to side. And then Martin Borgmeier and like Matt Wolf are good examples of transverse plane, which I call like starting a lawnmower. So it's more of a transverse plane rotational thing. Last year around this time, Congressional Country Club in DC hired me to go out there for 3 days. And I had lessons with members, I had sessions with the pros to teach them. And then I had a speed camp. They had 15 kids, 15 really good junior players, and they called it a speed camp. They're here with you for the next 2 hours to gain speed. And one of the things I did is we had 3 bays, and I said, everybody play the Goldilocks game. I want you to go into the bay and take your normal swing and hit me like 3 or 4 balls and note your club speed, ball speed, carry distance, all that kind of stuff. Then I want you to give me 3 Berkshiring it, and then I want you to give me 3 Matt Wolf / Martin Borgmeiering it. And every single one of those kids gained speed adding a trigger, and it was about 8 people Borgmeier and 8 people Berkshire. And so everybody's different, but frontal plane people, you want to go to the Kyle Berkshire type loading, and then the other one we want to go to, and then when we're transverse plane, we probably want to go. So that if I ever get a chance with Kuchar or Morikawa again, then we got to start using the the Martin Borgmeier or the Matt Wolf one. It always reminds me when I say that, I call it the lawnmower pre-shot routine. Forget where I was, somewhere in the Northeast, and these kids were there. And I said, it was like in, Westchester, Greenwich, Connecticut, or one of those really nice areas. And I told this kid, I was like, you want to go like you're starting a lawnmower, like this. And he looks at me, he's like, a what? I'm like, you know the thing that like mows the grass? And he's like, well, we got Jose, is that who you mean? Crazy. All right, so we understand, like, and everybody can see that down the line, right? You can see the swing plane, but you cannot see the engine from the ground. And I learned a lot about this from baseball. So you see Jose Altuve here, that is a pretty transverse plane task that he's just accomplished there. And Freddie Freeman here, That is a very frontal plane task that he's just accomplished. What I've discovered is that the best hitters in the world can switch between engines depending on where the ball's at. So if the ball's down, they turn into Freddie Freeman. If the ball's up, they turn into Jose Altuve. When we find somebody like that, we want to capture them and sign them and pay them every dollar that you have, because they are very rare hitters that can do that. Most hitters are pretty good up and not so good down, or pretty good down and not so good up. That's kind of what got me a lot of credibility in the baseball world. I remember the first meeting I had with the Blue Jays was on Zoom, and they sent me force plate data from one of their Dominican Republic kids that was playing in low A or something like that. No idea who this kid was. They just sent me graphs. And I was looking at the graphs and I said, I'll bet you this kid's good down in the zone, but not so good up in the zone. And one of their analytics guys was on the call and he had his computer in front of him and he's like, like, how'd you know that? And so I was kind of able to predict his analytics based on the ground profiles. That kind of got me some credibility. But now that I'm in it now and we're actually working with it, what I'm finding is for those type of people, if I try to make them better in the transverse plane, it can actually rob them from what they're already good at in the frontal plane. And the same thing, if they're good in the transverse plane, I try to make them better in the frontal plane, it can rob them from what they're already good at in the transverse plane. And so in baseball, it really comes down to an organizational decision. So if this kid is like 18 years old and you want him to be your everyday shortstop in 6 years or 4 years or whatever, then we might go down that road of trying to fix the plane they're not good in and try to balance them out to make them good everywhere. Or a lot of the teams are now using this in their analytics. So they know that the pitcher is more likely to put it down here, so my frontal plane guy is going to play that day. I had to sign a very strict NDA with the Blue Jays to make sure I did not share any of their data with anyone else, because if the Yankees or the Red Sox or the Dodgers find this out, it could be a massive advantage to how they pitch other players in this. So it's been a very interesting journey. I have taken what I learned from golf to baseball and learned a ton from baseball and kind of brought it back to golf. The good thing in golf is we're not at the mercy of where somebody else puts the ball. We can put the ball wherever we want. And I found that has helped my game tremendously. What I found from my own game being a kid, so I grew up in Canada where we could start golfing around middle of April. And I remember my game from middle of April till the middle of May was generally pretty good. And then I started playing baseball in the middle of May. And in the middle of May now I'm hitting balls up here. And my engine from the ground, I know, is entirely frontal plane. And so that's why my golf game got crappy when I started working on hitting balls up here. So now when I play golf, I get as close to it as I can, because I hit it way better from in there. Get it close to it, now I have to lift it up, and the way my engine works, I hit it great from in there. Wish I knew that a long time ago. All right, so when we measure forces in 3D, we measure three basic forces. We measure the medial lateral force or side-to-side force. In baseball, we like to call it the catcher-pitcher force. The force is kind of running along this direction. And then we measure the anterior-posterior forces. In baseball, we call it the first-third force, or the force towards and away from the ball. And then we measure the vertical force. And understanding which forces live in which plane is important. So if I'm concerned with your transverse plane mechanics, I do not care about your vertical forces, because that force actually cuts that plane through and doesn't live in that force or in that plane. And so when I worked on vertical forces with Matt Kuchar, that was a really bad match. Even though it did add a little speed to his swing, he did not like it because he could not control the golf ball in that plane or with that force addition in that plane. So if I have another chance at Matt Kuchar, we are going to work with AP forces and medial lateral forces. Those are the ones that live in the transverse plane. How about the frontal plane? Which forces live in the frontal plane? Now is where we talk about vertical forces. They live in the frontal plane, but the AP forces do not. So you see how these cut through the frontal plane? And so you will never see Jim Furyk do the TPI rainbow foot and jump away from the ball, because he does not have the AP forces with the club there that would ever produce that. So if you're working on TPI rainbow foot with a really high hands person, probably going to mess them up. They do not need that. They need more down up and maybe a little lateral, depending on their braking mechanism. So the vertical forces and medial lateral forces are the ones we concern ourselves with if we are working on frontal plane forces. So this paper came out in 2018 out of Dr. Kwan's lab at Texas Women's University. I think Chris Como is an author on this paper. And this shows us how we create momentum in the frontal plane and the transverse plane. And so in the frontal plane, what we have to do is produce a net force vector here that is at a distance away from our center of mass. So here's the center of mass of the human, and here's the net force vector. The length of this moment arm tells me how efficient you are at producing momentum in the frontal plane. And understanding what a moment arm is relatively simple. Everybody that has ever used a wrench in their life understands the concept of moment arm inherently, maybe not academically. But every one of us in our life has come up to a bolt with our fingers and gone and tried to twist it. And you get that face and you really twist, but it won't turn. Why won't it turn? Because you cannot create enough force over this tiny little moment arm to produce enough torque, because torque is the amount of force you produce times this distance, the perpendicular distance from where you're producing the force and the middle of the thing you're trying to twist. So if it's a really short moment arm, this number is really low, so you'd have to have this one be massive in order to twist it. And so what do? Give up? You get a wrench. You get a wrench, you put it on there, now I might be able to just tap this thing with my finger and it'll spin. Why? Because now this number is massive, so this one can be very small. I think the goal of golf instruction is optimizing moment arms for people. This is just a theory. I don't have any data to support it. Well, I have very limited data to support it. But if you can think of golf swings throughout the history of golf that you would consider to be effortless power, who would you talk about?
Sam Snead, Matt.
Fred
Fred
Couples.
Couples, Ernie Els, sure. Who?
Matt.
Map?
Nap.
Oh, Knapp. Yeah, sure, good. I have the opportunity to measure him. I know John Ortega very well, so I want to see that if that's true. But my theory is effortless power are people who are taking advantage of moment arms to create their speed versus having a lot of force in their system to create the speed. I had the very fortunate opportunity to work with Bryson DeChambeau recently a little bit. And he is not that efficient at creating moment arms. So when he tries to create speed, it looks like speed. Like he's really grunting and working hard. He is an incredible athlete and is able to create the forces to create tons of speed, but not that efficient with moment arms. If anyone's on Instagram or social media, I've learned a lot about this from a guy named Drew Cooper. Has anybody heard of him? No? Anybody at Instagram? We don't have any social media. Anyways, I don't know what you call him. I call him a golf ball whacker guy on Instagram. But he has an Instagram platform that has a lot of following because he can swing it really fast. I had him in my lab a couple years ago, and I remember watching him get up with driver, and his swing literally looked like this to me. And he was hitting a few shots, and I was like, oh, that's pretty solid. And I went and looked at the launch motor. It was like 135 club speed. Club speed. Not ball speed, club speed. And I was like, and so those effortless power people are the people that are really taking advantage of moment arms. And my theory is, if you're using moment arms effectively, you're going to be able to perform very well with minimal strain on your body. And that's why I think it's really important for all golf teachers to really understand this. Because why do golf courses have golf teachers? What's the point? Like, why does a country club have a teacher?
So they'll continue golf.
Exactly, to keep people there more often, right? If they're good at golf and they're there more often because they enjoy it more, they're going to buy more hot dogs and hamburgers and beer and wine and shoes and clubs and shirts and all the things. And so even if you're talking about Mrs. Haberkamp, getting her to be better with her moment arms will allow her to play the game more effectively with less strain on her body. Because you think a lot of these country clubs are getting older and older in terms of their membership, and if people start having knee and hip replacements and can't play anymore, then they're not going to be on property buying your hot dogs and hamburgers and beer and shirts and all that stuff. And so I think as teachers, if we can get better at understanding this concept and teaching this to pretty much everyone, it'll make everybody's life a lot better. So now back to our moment arms. So in the frontal plane, which two forces live in the frontal plane again? Side to side and vertical. So if you can see here, this vector right here has a little bit of horizontal force and then a lot of vertical force. And then it's the distance between there that we call the moment arm. Here is a player that is very efficient at producing a frontal plane moment in his swing. This is a kid named Tegan Andrews. Anybody ever heard of him? Yeah? He was the best golfer on our Cal State Fullerton golf team for like 4 years, just graduated last May, and he just got his PGA Tour Americas card like 3 days ago. He shot 10 under in one of the qualifying rounds for the PGA Tour Americas. He has had a 62 and a 61 recently. He shot 62 with 2 doubles like a couple weeks ago. This kid can play. He still has to learn how to wedge it close to the hole and chip and putt and stay away from all the bad things that prevent us from playing good golf. But I think he's got the tools to make it. So what you can see that he does is he gets to his peak lateral force right here. This is the top of his backswing. And he's at the peak of his lateral force, which is 13%. At this exact same moment in time, he's at his minimum vertical force. So he's unweighted the most that he ever does in his swing here at the same time as he's produced that peak lateral. So you can see his little force vector here is 13% lateral and 65% vertical, which creates this net force vector and creates a big long moment arm. To me, what I'm telling people, the way to create really efficient moment arms is through this unweighting of the vertical. How do we unweight the ground? Unweighting of the ground involves creating a negative acceleration or accelerating our mass down towards the ground. So some people who do it really well, you'll see them squat a little bit in transition, but that is a very difficult task because once I squat in transition, I better be able to turn it around and get up or I'm going to stick that club in the ground. So teaching Mrs. Haberkamp to squat in transition may not be your best move. So what else? How else can we unweight or produce accelerations towards the ground? Think about where we position this thing in the golf swing. What does a frontal plane player have to have this club? Where does it have to be? It has to be high. And if it's high, it has room to come down. Right here. You want to see an unweighting? Right there. That probably unweighted me to about 70% of my body weight by just letting that club drop a little bit. And so being able to time that peak lateral with the minimum unweighting is what allows us to create the big moment arm. Because if this was not 65 and this was like 80, what you'd see is a net vector that looked like this, and he'd probably cut his moment arm in half if he didn't have that ability to unweight. The reason I like the unweighting better to create a bigger moment arm, because your other option would be to push more laterally. So if I took this 13% and made it like 26, that would still give me a massive moment arm. The only problem with pushing laterally a lot is the next step becomes really hard, which is putting on the brakes. Because if I start going 26 this way and I get way past it, now I'm going to have some trouble too. Because once I put this moment arm into the system, so you can see this force pushing up, and that's this axis of rotation, it's going to try to spin the system in this direction. But what you have to learn to do is, because what this moment is doing is giving energy from the ground to your body. That's step number 1. What's step number 2? Giving energy from your body to this thing, and then eventually into the golf ball. And that's where the deceleration component becomes very important. And that's where a lot of people struggle. So in the frontal plane, we'll talk a little bit about deceleration here. So I got really enamored with Barry Sanders about a year ago, maybe a year and a half ago. There was a documentary on Amazon or something on him. Does anybody remember him as a running back? He was very small, so he never like ran over people. He wasn't like super fast, so he never just beat them with pure speed. So how is he one of the best running backs of all time? This is a picture of how. So watch, Rodney Peete gives him the ball, he goes to the right a little bit, slams on the brake and goes back left, and the whole Colts team keeps going to the right. He is able to stop going this way and going that way as you keep going that way as a defender. This one's great because you can see he's over here, he's at the 30-yard line. He knows he has a touchdown already because there's nobody over there. Pretty interesting. He is very able to decelerate. Now in golf, you're not trying to juke anyone, but we know from the kinematic sequence, deceleration is what passes energy distally in a human body, right? If I want to accelerate my left arm in the swing, I have to decelerate my thorax, right? As I decelerate it, that's what sends the energy distally. It's kind of like the whip analogy, right? If I have a whip in my hand, I just accelerate it the whole time. How much energy goes into that whip? Not much. But if I go, now that thing shoots out the other end. So we got to learn how to decelerate better. And when I think of deceleration, sometimes I call it braking. And then people think of the brakes in your car. What happens in your car when you touch the brake pedal? Those little rotors grab onto the wheel and stop it from spinning. Human bodies don't have that. If my elbow is moving into flexion, I don't have something that just goes and grabs on there and stops it. If I'm moving into flexion, how do I stop it? I have to turn on the extensors. I have to turn on my triceps to slow it down and stop it, and then eventually move it in the other direction. So we have to apply the opposite torque to create deceleration in human beings. So we don't have brake pedals. So I always tell my students, human beings are a lot more like a boat than like a car. If anybody's ever driven a power boat, if you're going too fast coming into that dock, what do? Slam it into reverse. That takes the propeller and starts spinning it the opposite way. Even though you're still going forward, that propeller spinning the opposite way slows you down coming in there. And that's what we have to do. So remember, at the top of the backswing, we want that net force vector to be on this side of our center of mass. So then how are we going to stop ourselves? Where does this force vector have to go? It has to go back here on the other side of our center of mass. Or else, if we leave it on this side of our center of mass the whole time, I think that's when we start to get these types of golf swings, which make low point control very difficult, which also don't make this part of our body very happy, and we probably swing it slower. So I'm telling golf teachers now, if you care about low point control, you care about swing speed, and you care about keeping your golfers healthy, we probably should start thinking about deceleration strategies. And if you don't care about any of those things, then don't worry about it. You guys can have a little nap right now. So how do we create that deceleration strategy? So Tegan is able to go from right here, where he's 13% and 65 or whatever it was, to right here where he's now reversed those things. So see, this one's at a minimum, this one's at a maximum. He's now reversed it, and he's 253 vertical and negative 16 lateral. So he's gone from positive lateral and minimum vertical to flipping those things. In how long? Club was at the top, and now look where it is. That's about 0.1-ish seconds later that he's able to flip those things. That is an incredible athletic skill, to be able to go from putting the energy into the system to breaking it right here. They've done some motor learning studies where they put people in a lab and put their finger on a button. And they tell that person, as soon as that light turns on in front of you, hit the button. And so in order for you to perceive a stimulus and order up a motor response is about 250 milliseconds, about half the time from the top of the backswing till here. They call that the neuromechanical delay. So do you think if this braking action is not so efficient, there is anything you might be able to tell him in a golf lesson to make this better? You think you can say, just think of this in your downswing and brake better? I don't think so. There may be something setup-wise that you could do to put them in a better position to brake, or you may be able to do, some backswing thoughts or some things that may be able to position them better that might allow them to brake. One of my go-tos now, if somebody struggles with braking, is like turning down the gas. So if I get to the top of my backswing and I'm producing like 30% lateral force, and I don't have a braking mechanism, a lot of times this negative force becomes very bumpy and jumpy because my theory is the body freaks out because it doesn't have the brakes to match the gas. So if I put you on the 5 freeway over here, and told you your car can only brake to 50 miles an hour and you got up to 80, what are you gonna be like in that car seat? You're gonna be freaking out, right? I can't stop this car going the speed that it's currently going, and I think that's most people's golf swings. And so one of the ways that you can in a golf lesson is just turning down the gas. So if I take you from 30 lateral and teach you how to unweight a little better and get it down to like 15 lateral, then your brakes can kick in. Great, that is one method you can use. Other than that, I think a lot of the stuff has to come down to changing that nervous system. Teaching that nervous system to work better and create that braking action, which generally takes a little bit more time. So Tegan, who's very good at it, I talked to him a bunch throughout his time at Cal State Fullerton. And I remember when I first saw this, you don't see this too often. Somebody who is this efficient naturally at swinging a golf club or at creating that negative moment arm. And I remember asking, what do you do like workout wise? And he said, well, you know, I lift with the team 3 days a week and I do yoga with my girlfriend and da da da. He goes through all this stuff. And then he kind of paused for a bit and he's like, oh yeah. And my dad's had this like slide board thing in my garage ever since I was a little kid. I've been sliding back and forth on that thing like forever. And I was like, ooh, let me think about that a little bit. So this is my lab now. I have one of these in my lab. And I have a lot of my golfers doing this drill. It's like a hockey training tool. You put the little booties on. That's like a very slippery surface. And your goal is to push off your trail side, then hit the left side and bounce off of it as quickly as possible. Because I'm moving laterally, and as soon as I hit that thing, I have to learn how to push that way into that little black thing. And if I push that way, what Newton tells us is the reaction force pushes us back. And having that like leak into your golf swing is something that I think is super important. And so using this as a braking or deceleration strategy, I don't think can hurt any golfer or baseball player. Because even if you are, like we've been talking mostly about frontal plane, but even if you are a transverse plane player, remember that this medial lateral force, that's where we're creating this braking action, it occurs in the frontal and transverse plane. It's the only one that's in both planes. And learning how to create that medial lateral braking force is super efficient, whether we're talking frontal or transverse. We had a super interesting discussion because generally in the past I've always gone down to the ground and taught people how to try to push in the ground better to create. But I remember when I first started doing this biomechanics stuff, some really educated golf instructor would ask me, so is it the movement of the body that creates the ground reaction forces or the ground reaction forces that create the movement of the body in the club? And my answer would always be yes. It goes both ways. And so we had a really interesting discussion at the PGA show a couple months ago. Greg Rose was on a panel with myself and a few other people, and Greg mentioned that like your external oblique, sorry, this is your internal oblique. Your internal oblique on your left side, if it contracts, it'll pull your thorax or your chest left. But if I keep my chest still and contract this muscle, it actually pulls my pelvis the other way. So the muscles, which is external oblique on the trail side and internal oblique on the lead side, that move the thorax towards the target actually move the pelvis back. And so I've had some success recently with transverse plane players creating more braking action by just telling them to take these shirt buttons and turn them left to the target as fast as you can. So activating the muscles that do this actually created much better braking on the ground. So that's another tool to keep in your toolbox. We didn't talk about it much, but the transverse plane engine comes from these forward and backwards ground reaction forces. So every golfer that I've ever seen kind of about left arm parallel is pushing their lead foot towards the golf ball. So if I push my lead foot towards the golf ball, the ground pushes back and shoves my hip backwards. At the same time, they're pulling this back foot away from the golf ball. And if I pull this foot back, that's going to shove my trail hip towards. And that's what creates rotation. The best transverse plane players, though, do about twice the pushing as they do the pulling. If I can push this towards the golf ball twice as much as I pull this back, the net force on my pelvis is going to get my pelvis moving back away from the golf ball and give me room for my hands and arms. the way to be an early extender, or to be one of those people who gets in their own way here, is to push about evenly between your feet. So if I see you got 15 and 15, you will probably be an early extender. You know what the best cure for that is that I've found recently? Hit balls below your feet. So I now have access to a studio that has a Zen swing stage in it. And every early extender that I've taken and just been like, okay, hit me some balls and figure it out, they figure out how to not early extend. Because if they do, they're gonna fall on their face. So that's basically the playpen of golf, is taking the ball and putting it below your feet. Another thing that I use that swing stage for a bit, I just used it yesterday with one of my wife's players, is for people that put 30% lateral force in and have no brakes and kind of glide past it like this. I had a really interesting time, it was about a year ago, maybe a year and a half ago. I got to work with Jeff Sluman, who was considering giving up playing the Champions Tour because he just couldn't compete out there anymore. And he was losing a lot of speed. And what I discovered on the force plates is his lateral braking was pretty poor. And I talked to him about the slide board and different things that he can do to work on it. And I said, the other thing you can do is hit balls on a downhill slope. So if I take my stage and I tilt it like this, you better figure out how to brake or you're gonna fall down the slope. And Jeff looked at me, he's like, oh man. And I was like, what? He's like, you know, I probably played 500 rounds of golf at Augusta National in my life, probably more than that. Through every practice round, every tournament round over whatever it is, 20 years or whatever, plus like when people have invited me out to play there and all those times. And he's like, I've never hit it far enough to get to the bottom of the slope on 9. So I always have a downhill lie to an uphill green, which is a really hard shot. He's like, I can't think of a bad shot I've ever hit into that green. Because that downhill slope forces him to put on the brakes properly, and being the athlete that he is, he just figures it out. Now, and he was like, damn, I wish I knew that 30 years ago, because we could have worked on it. But it was interesting. My wife's player was swinging it really slowly and struggling with lateral braking. I just put it like this and said, figure it out. Her first 5 shots were like drop kick, really fat, terrible shots. But just let her keep figuring it out. Didn't say anything. I just said, okay, try to figure out how to flush it. And eventually, well, it makes sense that they're fat because the ground behind the ball is higher than the ground below the ball, so she kept hitting into it until she learned how to post up and get that lateral braking happening. So using slopes as a constraint in your golf instruction can be extremely powerful. And that's why I think, you know, something that you can move around like this Zen swing stage is a great thing. How much time do I have left? Anybody here? What time's the next rotation?
It's 2:15 now, but I don't know the rotation.
Okay. Nobody looks like they're rushing too much. So somebody want to hit some? I want to get this thing up. All right, come on up.
Can I ask you a question?
You sure can.
You're seeing a lot of pros actually taking the club, and it is very vertical. They don't go over.
Yeah.
Is that part of this?
So sorry, they take the club very vertical.
They keep it in the vertical and start down.
Oh, like
they
this.
Don't let it go over.
Yeah, well, that just makes it a lot like, because as soon as it crosses the line or goes over like this, then it takes a lot more time for it to come back. So I would say,
But you just seen that more. In the last year. You know,
yeah.
That they're just totally
I think,
straight up.
well, my theory on that is, I work a lot with a guy named Ben Shear, who's in the Northeast. He's like a physical trainer, and he does a lot of assessments on golfers before he lets them hit a ball. He gets them to vertical jump and do a whole bunch of things. And he classifies people into resistors or releasers. So a resistor would be like John Rahm, right? Like whoosh, like really short backswing whoosh, and hitting it. And a releaser would be like Phil Mickelson, right? Big, long swing. And I always make the analogy to like cars. I drive a Prius. I can get my Prius to 90 miles an hour, but it takes me about a week and a half. I got a friend who drives a Tesla. He's there in whatever, 6 seconds or something like that. So the Tesla would be Rahm, the Prius would be Mickelson. They both get to 90 miles an hour, they just do it very differently. My theory is a lot of the kids going out on tour now and the swings you're seeing on tour are such athletic people now that they're a lot more John Rahmish than Phil Mickelson-ish. I think, like I was talking to Ben today, and a lot of the tour swings now are not searching for speed anymore, because literally nobody's getting out there anymore with that 185 ball speed. They all have 185 ball speed, and what they're finding is the kids that are 185 and go searching for 200, now when you miss it off the toe, it's X'd. Used to be left rough, now it's gonzo at 200. And so they're finding the juice from 185 to 200 really isn't worth the squeeze yet, unless they roll the ball back. And then it may be a different discussion. But my theory is I think just a lot more better springy athletes are taking up the game and can swing it that way. Doesn't mean that we should teach our players to swing it that way, because most of the people I deal with are not those kids that are on tour and are swinging at 185, chipping at 185. Like that's, there's some special athletes out there. My theory is just kids that are athletes now play golf where they used to not. They would go play football and basketball and take out golf later when they were older and couldn't play those sports anymore. But some kids are actually choosing it now because they don't want CTE and all the shit that comes with the other sports. Anyways, so I hope that helps. Yeah. All right, hit me a couple. Do you want to swing a few to warm up? So I'll get you to hop on there. Just stand still for 1 second. All the forces are relative to your body weight, so we need to measure it first. Okay, go ahead, hit away. Sounded pretty pure.
Was that a cut? Okay.
All right, so that one carried 156. I know you're not warm, is that? It's a little short.
170.
Okay, let me give you one more. We'll give you one more to warm up here.
60, it takes me a while.
Yeah, I know, I'm the same. Nice. So one thing I also notice here in him that I didn't talk about today is he's got a lot of foot flare in both feet. His feet are both turned out like this. I've been studying a lot about foot flare recently because I think that carried about 65, so that's getting closer. I really think your foot flare needs to match your own personal anatomy. I was really interested in Yani Seng's discussion today about her hip problems and some of the stuff that's happened, because so I'm actually an assistant professor at the University of Arkansas Medical School now. I decided to do that because they have imaging facilities there, and that's something I thought I was missing, was really understanding the underlying anatomy of each person. And the first studies we've been doing since I've been there is looking at the structure of people's hips, because I think it's one of the most important joints in our body to do athletic things. And when I took anatomy when I was in school, they told me that the cup, or the acetabulum that creates the hip socket, points sideways like this. And my first meetings I had at Arkansas was with 4 or 5 hip surgeons who are replacing people's hips every day. So these 5 or 6 people are opening up people's hip joints, cutting all the ligaments, and popping the hip out of socket. That's what they need to do to replace your hip. And they're doing it 5 to 6 times every day and then staring at that socket. And I asked them, does everybody have a hip socket that points sideways like this? And they're like, no. Some people it points forward, which we call an anteverted hip. Some people it points backwards, which we would call a retroverted hip. I would hope, based on your flare, that your hips are retroverted, because that would match a very flared foot. So I did a session like this at the Southern Florida PGA 2 years ago, I believe now. And there was this one golf teacher that came up to hit balls, and he had very late vertical forces. So we want the vertical forces to be at the latest club parallel to the ground, and even earlier generally the faster you swing it. And his vertical forces were like at impact. And I was like, I think your vertical forces are late. I want you to try to square up your lead foot. Because before working with Mike Adams, that was what we always talked about. And his theory was, if I squared up my lead foot, watch how soon my left leg locks up. Like I get right here, my left leg locked up. If I turn it way out, watch how far I can turn through before the left leg locks up. So he thought squaring it up vertical earlier, turning it out verticals later, which makes sense in theory. But we're not dealing with theory, and we're not dealing with robots, we're dealing with human beings. So this kid, or this golf teacher that I was working with, he had like kind of just a little bit of flair. And I said, can you square it up and hit me one? And he's like, oh, I don't like that. And I was like, what are you talking about? He's like, well, last winter I went skiing, never skied before. They tried to get me to do the snowplow position. He's like, I felt like my hips were gonna explode in the snowplow position. So that cued me to think, ooh, maybe he's retroverted in his hip. I said, okay, forget the square it up, turn it out as much as you possibly can. And he hit a shot, turned out as much as he possibly could. The verticals went earlier, increased by about 30%, and he gained like 7 miles an hour club speed. And so matching the amount of foot flare to their own individual anatomy, I think is really important. Now, the best way to do that is with an MRI machine. If you had an MRI and we could take it of your hips, we could see where that cup points. Yeah, right in that little garage right there. But that is ultimately like, I mean, in 1998, when I first started doing force plate research, the only force plates at the whole university that I was at were anchored to the foundation of the hospital. Because that's what you used to have to do. You used to have to anchor force plates to the foundation of the building you were in. And there are only 2 of them. They were like 100 grand a piece back then. Now there's 2 force plates that work better than those ones I used in 1998, and they came in that carry-on bag right there, 2 here today. I took them to Hawaii for the Hawaii section meeting and put them as a carry-on above and down. Explaining to TSA what they are is one thing, but they let me on the plane with them. So it's pretty crazy to me. So who knows, hopefully in my lifetime that will be possible. Until that point, the Goldilocks method is the best one, especially if you have force plates. Because if you're comfortable out here and you can see, like, look how smooth these forces are that he's produced. There's no big bumpiness in them. They're very smooth. I'm gonna leave his foot flare alone and assume that he's retroverted. And if I'm a golf teacher that thinks square feet are better, I will probably mess up his golf game and probably send him to an orthopedic surgeon in not very long. And so please don't do that to people. I have a lot of golf teachers that I've seen are trying to teach the long drive move, which is lift the heel and plant it closer to the target. If you're anteverted, great. If you're retroverted, I got an orthopedic surgeon over there. I'll give you his card because you'll probably be needing to see him pretty soon. So we have to make sure that we don't mess that up. And one of the best ways to not mess it up is to have him hit on one of these. Because I think you'll then know if you're in a position that doesn't match you, and you'll see the bumpy forces and you'll be able to get out of that quickly before you have them go see a surgeon. All right, let's analyze your forces. First, let's look at the frontal plane. All right. Whoa. Make this one empty. Okay. So if you see here, I'm going to take his swing to the top, right where he's putting that frontal plane energy into the swing. Wow. That is impressive. So you can see he has matched the peak lateral force, which is 14, with his minimum, which is like 50%. So he's unweighted more than 50% of his body weight, which has given him a very good moment arm. I can put the forces on here so you can see it. So you can see if I extend that green line up, he's gotten his center of mass would be probably, we could turn on the motion capture, but I won't take the time to do it. Center of mass would probably be there. He's created a very efficient moment arm there. And so he's very efficient in the frontal plane. Now, he could be one of those freaks like Tiger and Adam Scott and the like middle of the road players who are efficient in both planes. And then you keep kind of a neutral position and you can mess with it however you wish. Let's see if that is the case. So to look at your transverse plane engine, you then look at these y-axis forces. Let me find the other one here. Whoops. And then we look at right and left. Okay. So not quite as efficient in the transverse plane. So you can see he's reached the peak of his right foot force here at 16%, and he's still ramping up to get to the peak of his left foot force, which gets up to 21%, but they're not matched in time. And so my analogy for transverse plane forces is always taking the lid off a water bottle. How many people ever tried to take the lid off a water bottle by pushing with your finger, then pulling with your thumb? Nobody would do that, right? You do them at the same time. And so the fact that those aren't lined up in space, even though the magnitudes are okay, I would say you're putting the energy into the system, you're way more efficient in the frontal plane than the transverse plane. Which, to start with, I would say, if you're gonna make a mistake, you gotta be closer to the golf ball. Hands gotta be higher. Now, the next thing we need to look for is his braking action and see how good he is at braking. Now that we've decided that he is probably more frontal than transverse, do you hit, I mean, those are pretty straight balls, but draw or fade generally?
Fade.
He's Yanni saying he's trying to turn a cut swing into a draw.
Interesting. Okay. But you like a cut better, or you?
He hates
I
it,
like
but
the
he
look
plays
of
a
a,
lot better with the cut.
I like the look of a draw better than
Okay. Because your frontal plane mechanics would generally match a draw better. I mean, I would say are a little bit more efficient right now, but is that because what you're trying to do, or is that?
With my irons, it's pretty straight.
Okay.
Not a lot of movement.
Okay. Let me just see what your braking action is like, because that's the next step. So remember, after this phase where he's very good at putting the energy into the system, how does he brake? And this is what you see a lot of the time with people. This is more normal. What you saw with Tegan is not normal. So your vertical is very late. So this is where your peak vertical happens, where the ball's already gone and you're well past impact. And your peak braking action happens when the ball has probably already landed and you put the club back in your bag. Very late. So there's your peak braking action. So if you do want to draw the ball, we need to work on brakes because they're really slow and really late. I would like to see, like, if you tried to cut it, if those transverse plane mechanics got a lot better. And if they did, then I think that might be, I don't know, you guys seem to be arguing over what's best for you, but that's where we would need to play a little bit more. But if you decide that draw is the shot for you, you're really good at putting the energy in the system, but the deceleration braking part is not good, which is where I would start to worry about low point control and some back issues, and you're probably not swinging it as fast as you could. And so we would start working on some braking action if he decided he really wanted to draw it. I don't see any really adverse, like there's no super bumpy forces where I would say, oh, let's stay away from that for sure. And so I think with him you could kind of go in either direction depending on what you wanted to do. But that would be a longer term project with you. But the braking, I think, does take a little bit more time. And when it's a frontal plane brake that I'm working on, trying to turn the chest more through it generally creates a more leftward swing direction, which makes a functional draw very difficult. So that might tell me, if that works to fix your brakes, then that might tell me, yeah, we need to go in the transverse direction with you. Looks like all the other groups are moving. Any questions? All right, I will hang out here a little bit afterwards if you want to come back. If you didn't get a chance to hit, we can do that.
Private lessons?
Yeah.
How would I